All right, so as Daniel said, I'm not going to present to you what you can do with Kamailio, rather than what Kamailio is actually doing for you at the moment. And so we are going to talk about the new build system, actually packaging build system, which is running behind the scenes of Kamailio. And I know Kamailio is a pretty... Oh, I need to turn it up. Or speak louder. All right? Better? Yeah. All right. Kamailio is actually a pretty big and vibrant project already, with like hundreds of modules, and I think it's like 130 active contributors to the system. So things might get a little bit messy sometimes. So what I'm going to do, or going to present today, is what we have as of today in terms of infrastructure behind Kamailio, and how we're actually trying to do some sort of quality assurance on the Kamailio project. And then I would like to invite you to a discussion on how we are going to proceed further with that. And this is mainly targeted to anyone already contributing to the Kamailio project, like doing documentation and doing source code contributions, things like that. And yeah, maybe you have some ideas also how we could improve the whole project as a whole. So what we are having today is our Kamailio repository at that.kamailio.org. And what we are doing is we are building like 4 different versions of Kamailio in 2 ways. One is there are these stable releases which Daniel does like every half a year or something like that, a couple of months. And we are building Debian packages and Ubuntu packages for that, for 3 versions, for 0, free, and we are going to support more or less like 3 versions at all times. So once we're going to release 4.2, the free one will probably be dropped. And we're doing nightly builds on master. So you actually get Debian and Ubuntu packages for the latest version we are having. And again for 4.1, 0, and free. And we are doing that, as I said, for both Debian and Ubuntu. And on the Debian side, we're supporting Squeeze, VC, and Jessie. And on Ubuntu, the current LTS precise. But actually, nothing holds us back from supporting more Ubuntu versions. There just wasn't any need for that so far. So if you are using other Ubuntu versions, then you probably need to speak up and just say, hey, what about supporting that as well? And the thing is that we are supporting all of that on 2 different architectures. So one is AMD 64 and the other one is EU386. So this exists today. How did it work in the past? Like, how were Debian packages and Ubuntu packages being made, like until I think until February or something like that? It was a manual process, and it was not so easy and was quite hackish actually, but it was better than nothing. So we could at least provide Debian packages. The only thing is that in the Kamailio source itself, we have this pkg Kamailio deb repository, or a directory with the build targets there, and you had to manually move them, and then you had to manually trigger a source build out of that. You had to copy that thing into some change root, and then you had to build the packages with that, and finally somehow bring it into the repository. So the result was that it was actually non-reproducible builds, because this change root that was being bootstrapped once for every Debian version, like when a new Debian version came out, then it got bootstrapped once, and probably even packages or package versions were not even there anymore when you try to rebuild this stuff. So you end up with broken dependencies and all kind of mess with that. But again, it was better than nothing, and it was great that we were at least having something. So we were like, okay, then let's just use continuous integration for that, because that makes stuff much more easy. We just automate everything. So what we are using is some experience from what we are doing at Zipwise, and we try to map it onto the Kamailio project. So we're actually using two things for Kamailio. We are using the Jenkins CI project, and we are using the Jenkins Debian glue in order to somehow put it together or map it to the Debian repository things. So now, actually, what is continuous integration? Probably a lot of people have heard of that, especially developers. So what you actually do is, you're trying to, or you're doing development, you're committing it to some source control, you're building it, you're testing it, and then you get feedback loop if it works, right? So the thing is, usually, or the classical style of development is rather something like, okay, I'm going to build it, I'm calling make, it works on my machine, I don't care anymore, right? So, but what about other architectures? What about other distributions you're using? What about the tests you're probably not running, right? So, continuous integration is just a way of getting early feedback of what you're doing and if everything you're doing really works. And you can put this together with Jenkins. What is it? Well, generally speaking, from their website, it's an application that monitors execution of repeated jobs. That's it. So fair enough. But it's specifically built for building and testing of software projects and for monitoring execution of external jobs. And this is exactly what we are needing, right? We are needing to build our Kamailio, we are needing to test what we build, and we need to execute external jobs to put it into our Debian and Ubuntu repositories we are having. So, the way it basically works is, in theory, so it's not exactly how it's going to work or how it's currently working with Kamailio for various reasons I'm going to address. Basically what you're doing as a developer is you push some commits you're doing locally onto the repository. And the first thing which should actually happen is that on this code you were committing, there are unit tests being run, right? Then it needs to build the source package, it needs to build the binary, it needs to package that whole thing as a whole, it needs to test if upgrades to this new version from older versions work, if downgrades work, if uninstallation works, and only then it should end up in a repository, right? So what you get with that is that you can catch errors really early and often, because if one of those things breaks, for example, you messed up, I don't know, let's say you just did a commit and it doesn't even compile, then it shouldn't actually be allowed to somehow reach the repository. Or if some tests are failing, like, okay, you have unmet dependencies now, you're including header files that are not on your system, on your target, then it will just inform you about that and say, hey, you better fix that before we are going to include that into our repo. So the way it works at Zipwise, we're doing lots of stuff, right? So, but that's not really important. The important thing is you can do, if you want, lots of stuff. So we have developers, we commit code, we produce packages, we test them, we try to do this integration test, like is the upgrade working, is the uninstallation working, are the dependencies okay? Once the packages are in the repository, we are building virtual machines. We are trying to fire up these virtual machines. We're running high-level tests, like trying API calls and checking if everything which is actually supposed to be now in the database is really there. Then we are building installation medias and stuff like that. But the thing is, we don't need all this kind of stuff for Kamailio, not today at least. So how it works today is every day at midnight, Kamailio is doing a nightly build. If there are new commits being pushed throughout the day, or if somebody created a new tag for a release. So it triggers this nightly build, and it creates the release packages and the snapshot packages, like these nightly packages you're getting. So this is what we currently are doing with Kamailio today. And basically the way it works is that we are using Jenkins, and there are 4 different types of jobs we are currently using. We are using the source jobs, which are actually taking the Git repo, or whatever is in the Git repo, and building Debian source, or Ubuntu Debian source packages out of that. If that works, it tries to compile the whole thing, right? It tries to build your real Kamailio binary package and the module packages which are actually going to install. we have this PureParts job which tries to install that in a defined environment. So we are actually, after the packages are there, we're trying to install them, see if all the dependencies are there, if it really installs fine, if it uninstalls fine, and only then it goes into a repo job which actually updates the dep Kamailio org repository. And all these 4 jobs together for all these architectures and distributions we are supporting are currently, takes around 3 hours of build time nightly. So the way it works is, we like distributing things and we like to experiment with new things and come up with interesting ideas. So what we did is, we implemented the whole thing on Amazon Web Services. So what you're getting, or where you are ending up with when you are installing Kamailio from a repository, is on Jenkins master instance, actually a rather small EC2 instance, which is hosting the repository and which is actually running the source and repository jobs on there. And what it does every day at midnight, it parses our Git repo, git zip router.org, for any changes, new tags, new commits. And if there is something to do, then it fires up dynamically big Jenkins slave machines as EC2 instances and starts the real heavy lifting, like doing the binary builds and doing the PurePart jobs. And once they are completed, they report back to the master, and the master then adds them to the repository. So that's basically how the whole thing works. And the nice thing about that is everything we were doing is open source. So you could, like, SAMS people, where are you? You can do the same thing, right? Probably we can do the same thing for you. Or whatever software project we're talking about, you could do the same stuff. You don't have to build your binaries, your Debian packages by yourself. And there are the links we're using. So many thanks to Michael Prokop, who is not here today, who actually helped us building the whole thing, and to Victor, doing all the work. And we have documented the whole thing in the Kamailio dep Jenkins repository we are hosting on GitHub. So there it's really defined on how you set up your Jenkins, how the whole jobs are being set up so you can do this distributed builds. Now the thing is, what's next? Because we have seen there's quite a gap between how the whole thing theoretically works and how it works with Kamailio today. So we left out quite a lot of things. Usually, we see that from time to time in Kamailio, people are pushing their changes and they don't build, right? And then like 2 hours later, something on the mailing list complains, hey, you pushed that, it doesn't compile. And then, yeah, well, I forgot this or that, and he needs to do that again. We are not checking that at the moment, not today. We are not building the whole thing per push. Because it doesn't make that much sense. It would cover at least these compile errors, but the whole thing really starts making sense if we would have extensive testing. Because what we could then do is we are going to build that, and then we could module by module start checking the functionality there. So if you change something in, let's say, the domain module, we could actually fire up a test environment automatically and checking the functions or the modules you were changing to see if they still work as expected. The thing here is we are lacking test coverage a lot in Kamailio, which is bad. But this is something we are going to improve, or we need to improve somehow. The other thing is introducing like long-term tests, like firing up Kamailio in an automated way and hammer it with zip requests over a long period of time to see if there are any memory leaks or something like that. Or if you somehow at some points with some commits suddenly degrade your performance by some factor. And the other thing is, yeah, improving automated testing, right? So the dream really would be for Kamailio to have configuration files which really test all the modules function by function by feeding in defined inputs and checking if the function, the Kamailio module function, is really doing what it's supposed to do. Because only then we can make sure that we are really having stable software. And Kamailio is not for the little kids, actually. It's being used in huge telcos, telco environments. So it would be an important thing to do. And the other thing is code review. So I'm raising the question today to the developers and contributors and potential contributors if we maybe want to introduce something like Gerrit to our system. Because the way it works today is either people are, I mean, there are the developers which have commit rights to the project, right? And then there are people who just want to contribute. And the thing is that there's no clear way actually in Kamailio on how to contribute code. Some people post their patches on the mailing list, some people post their patches on FlySpray or Bug Tracker, they get deprecated, they get reviewed or not, they make it into the project or not, and it's really, there are no clear workflows about that. And the interesting thing, for example, with Gerrit would be that everybody could push branches to Gerrit, and there would be a selected list of like core developers or whoever wants to step up, and people would need to sign the changes off. So not only people, but also Jenkins, for example. So we could actually use our build system. If somebody pushes a branch to our Gerrit system, Jenkins could try immediately to see, does it even compile? Does it work? Do the tests run? Because then the developer, like Daniel, would have a lot less to do checking, hey, does this even make sense what this guy is doing, right? Because then already Jenkins said it works, the test works, so basically if the functionality is needed, then you would just review it, you could reject it, you could iterate on it, and if it works, then you just press a button and it automatically gets merged in the project. And that would be really, really awesome. And the other thing is that you get the feedback and code in one place. So you're not discussing your patch in the development mailing list by posting it on a bug tracker. You know at least what's going on, having a proper history on that. So that would be really, really great for Kamailio, and I really want to somehow trigger at least a discussion about getting something like that into our project. And the thing is, how can you help? Well, we are just proposing what we think at Zipwise, what might make sense, which works for us, which works for other projects. And the question is, would it work for Kamailio? I don't know. But we should start discussing these things. We should start discussing what is actually missing. Because one thing I can immediately think of is Daniel is now building RPM packages somehow in this OpenSUSE thing, and nobody else probably knows how it's being done. So one thing would be, okay, let's move this whole stuff to Jenkins too. The other thing is, we need more tests. There's actually no real way around that. We are going to need more tests, and we need to motivate somehow ourselves to do that. And since we would have the environment to do that with Jenkins, executing them and reporting back on them, we just would need to start somehow, right? And the other thing you can help is sharing your experience with either any of the tools I was mentioning, like Gerrit, Jenkins, whatever, building RPMs, and just provide your feedback on that. How does it work for you? Does it make sense for you? What would you actually like to see in a project? So, and that's like, okay, what use cases could we actually cover with Gerrit? Or do we don't need it, or I don't know. Other stuff like code tests, analysis. So what works for you in terms of unit tests? Do you have some test environment? I think we have Eloy doing configuration framework testing. We at Zipwise have our Kamailio configuration testing framework, which we all could somehow put together and getting it into the project. And that would be, let's say, the topics of the discussions we should actually have. So, what do you think?
Really basic question about continuous integration workflows. So when you have this requirement that when something gets pushed up, it needs to be testable.
Yeah.
So does it follow from that you must bundle your commits into minimally viable testable units? So is that a policy that you can expect people to consistently adhere to? In other words, what if you have certain interdependent commits that, until they're all committed, or cannot necessarily be tested, or a certain sequence of pushes that for one reason or another makes sense, but doesn't lead to testability?
In my opinion, the software status, which is in Kamailio master, should be releasable at any time. That's my personal opinion. So if you are doing commits to your, like, which don't work, which don't build, which are not testable or whatever, you shouldn't commit them to master. You should commit them to your private branch, and once it works, and Jenkins can actually trigger a build for your branch. That's not a problem. He could say, okay, I'm just trying to build my Alex new feature branch. It would do the tests on that, and they will fail. Until at some point you are finished pushing your stuff, and then, and only then, when all the tests are good, you should merge this stuff to master. That's my personal opinion on how it should actually work.
I think it's also done in other projects like Linux Scrum.
It's nothing new. I mean, we didn't come up with this stuff.
I have one or two remarks with regards to testing. We at 1&1 have a testing framework which is more targeted to configuration, regression catching, conformity to the product specification, this side of things. But maybe we can discuss a bit about the experience we had, because we also the guys from development that we wrote it several times.
No.
And a second thing, I started some years ago in the project also some kind of small tests, which are just test the basic things you mentioned. I try to load several modules, try to execute several functionality in the configuration with regards to a module.
They're just not used.
They're not used, and they're of course they're really basic. They're really basic, so you need somehow they need to be extended. I think more than half of them probably don't work anymore. I did some work very recently on that, but it's not really complicated work. We just basically need somebody to execute the logic which is in the modules, and I mean, it would be really great if we have for all the modules at least some kind of 80% checks to catch the really stupid errors that we release some code out there to our users and the module will not even load, for example. And this is not really the quality I would like that we offer as a project. I think we should do better, and I think we can do better. This is exactly
I think that's actually from a technical perspective, that's actually pretty easy. I mean, we are doing that we are having like around 100 or so projects at Zipwise, which we are putting together, like the ones we are controlling, plus all the packages from upstream. And we are nightly building virtual machines, complete environments, which we are then firing up. And then we are running, thanks to Victor, automated zip tests against that. And what we are doing is, we have this framework, which we definitely should push to the community more, is we have pretty complex Kamailio configurations. They are like 2,000–3,000 lines of Kamailio config, right? And they have lots of routes there. And every time we change something there, you are never quite sure, for example, if this doesn't break something else. So what we came up with is this something like this tracing module where you can have debug tags in your routes and just see, okay, if I'm doing this core flow, then I'm expecting these routes to be visited, I'm expecting these variables and AVPs to be set at the beginning of the route, and I expect these variables and AVPs set at the end of the route, right? So what we can check today already, nightly for example, is if AVPs, variables, whatever you pass into modules are actually being processed correctly, for example. Another thing would be really a more basic thing you're pointing out, saying, okay, I'm having like lots of core modules, which would be pretty easy to test. You just have your route, you're doing, okay, the only thing you're doing is, for example, checking is domain local, for example, right? And then you're just injecting via zip-p or zip-sec or anything else, just a zip message, and you're just comparing, okay, I'm having this in my variable, like Kamailio org, and I want to check, is this domain local, like is it somewhere in the database or not, and then check the return code. So if somebody now is going to change this module, I would expect that this function still works, right? And with this kind of tests, we can do that stuff with all of the modules, or most of the modules at least. TN is probably an exception because there are lots of timing things going on there, but a lot of modules are really just, you feed something in, you get something out back, and it doesn't do any magic internally. So.
Yeah, okay, I just want to add that this kind of work will be very welcome. What we do now also for testing. We have a couple of services which are like free to use on trial mode, more or less, like webuser.org in UK. They have quite good population of subscribers. The website is down. We have now open RCS. Also, Untitled.org was used to deploy like early stage before releasing stable versions. But this is something that I will really like to have in the project, because we do focus on stability. Besides, that saying best testing is production. This will really help us a lot.
But not our production, the other productions, please.
But no, indeed, there are sometimes stupid side effects that you don't think it is something very basic that someone will notice easier if you take a second look. But we are humans, and working the 25th hour of the day, it's sometimes you are tired. Okay.
I mean, also code review is not meant to control somebody else. It's also it's really a valuable tool to learn something, because especially Daniel is doing lots of contributions, and you can just follow his stuff. Probably nobody of us is going to sign off his commits, but still you can follow them and say, okay, what did he do? Oh, he did it that way. Oh, that module now works this way, that way. This is how it evolved, and this is how a user commented on that during development time. So it's a really valuable tool, in my opinion.
Maybe you can allow users to upload tests to prove that their bugs are valid. So if the test runs through.
Yeah, that would be good with reports. Your report is not validated unless it is confirmed.
Exactly.
Yeah, but to have that, we have to have a framework or something.
Yeah, we have to work. I mean, it's not a small work to do, and what you did already, it's probably better than the others, quite a lot of effort. So it's why some other guys should come and help, even by making some scenarios or providing some config I think should be part of the testing.
Yeah, I think it's important to just start somewhere, and this needs to come from the core developers, like providing a way or some skeletons on how tests are actually going to look like, because then you can just take one existing test and just copying it and adapting it to something else. And once we start and have at least some tests, then it's pretty plausible that people are going to come and create more of them.
We have a core developer from this time. Victor, it's a core developer.
I am.
So it has to come from the core developer. Great.
I'm glad to see you're using Jenkins to build devs. So I'm using Jenkins at my company to build devs for both Kamailio and for Asterisk. But in addition, what we also do in Jenkins is we're running the Asterisk test suite. And most of the tests that in the framework for the Asterisk test suite is there's two functions that we're interested in. One is spawning up Asterisk with a given configuration file, and the other one is spawning up SIP-Ps with that. And I was wondering if it would be just interesting to do, I'll say, a port of those functions, port essentially that Asterisk 10 program, have it be the basis of a Kamailio test framework.
It would be great to have something where we can base our work on. I think we're not going to do that from scratch. So.
Yeah, sure.
One of the things I didn't think you mentioned was code coverage and automated code coverage checking. I just wanted to sort of throw out there and see what you thought about it, because I found that really useful for motivating people to write tests. If Jenkins sort of publishes, 20% of your code was covered by tests, now it's 18%. It sort of keeps people honest and stops them just checking code without any tests. And also, if you're just writing tests, you then get that instant feedback of, oh, it's gone from 20 to 25% coverage. Do you think that's a good tactic to use for Kamailio?
Honestly, I don't know. So that's what I want, or what I really like to hear from you guys on what's your experience and what are the approaches that are maybe going to work for that, because it needs some changes in our workflows.
I think we are not yet there that we could think about code coverage tests. Maybe we should focus on functional tests that test modules and the server as a whole, and then after we had done that, maybe we can go the next step, which is basically is think about the module and then code coverage for the whole function space, etc.
Just anecdotally, just to follow up on what Tori said, we're in the Astros project, we're up to 433 functional tests on Trunk that are all SIP scenarios and things like that. So we've learned a lot of pain points on what's the best way to write tests, what's the fastest way to write tests, to make it painless for developers. A lot of pain over the past couple of years learning those processes. So when you guys are ready, I'm very, very interested in talking with you and sharing what we've learned.
Yeah, Rob actually.
That would be great.
Rob will
Yeah.
have tomorrow some presentation with CP, so you can bug him around. If a scenario doesn't look that nice as you would expect to be. Okay, we can get a last question.
Yeah, I guess I got another question, which is kind of dirty of me. So when testing network services that interface with lots of outside I/O, which hardcore functional programming people derisively term side effects, but we just refer to as real life. There's always a debate about the meaningfulness of tests which can be automated relatively easily, even taking into account stuff like SIP-E and very complex scenarios and so on and so forth. There's always a question of, well, you've got these, the ideal product that is the most lends itself to testing is like some sort of self-contained library or something that's highly deterministic, where a lot of the breakage is really about tracing the logic. But there's so much stuff in Kamailio that happens in deferred binding and at runtime, and nobody even find out about it unless your test really is extremely functional. And sometimes mimicking that functionality is just not trivial. So in the end, when you zoom out and look at it a little bit, clearly the fact that you're advocating a substantial amount of test-driven development here, I think, telegraphs your position on this issue. But outside of testing some very formal, deterministic kind of this comes in, this comes out type functionality, in terms of improving the overall quality and reliability of the project in a very practical, pragmatic, real-life oriented kind of way, improving bottom line results, is there a lot to be achieved with putting a lot of work into these tests with something like Kamailio as opposed to something that's closer to the application level like Asterisk? I think that's an important question. I'm not really sure what the answer is.
Well, I think so, because it's, for me as a developer, I cannot have the 100% assurance that if I'm going to change something in Kamailio, some module or whatever, doing stuff, that everything is expecting to work like it's supposed to be. But at least these tests are going to cover lots of basic things, probably, some more advanced things even, so I can have, or I can be a little bit sure, at least, right, that I haven't done completely wrong with what I was doing. So I am committing something, and I can be sure, well, at least the tests we are having, they're still working. And the way it's going to work is anyways that, hey, the tests we're going through, still I broke Kamailio. Then okay, then I need to write another test which is going to cover that. And that way we will improve with our testing. I think it isn't really meaningful saying, okay, now we're going to need to write thousands of tests today, and we are not going to touch the code we're producing until all of that is in place. It's just a dynamic process anyway. So,
yeah.
And every test more we have is better than not having it, in my opinion.